Hey everyone, Pastor Jake here, and although I'm not there with you in person today, it gave me this great opportunity to introduce you to a friend of mine. For today's message, you're going to hear a conversation between me and Doug Hammack. He is the founding pastor of a community called Common Thread Church in Raleigh, North Carolina. He recently, after 30 years of ministry, has passed the torch and has retired. But we connected fairly recently, and he has been generous enough to just mentor me and speak into my own journey as a leader, particularly kind of give me some wisdom and insight of the things that he's learned over the past 30 years, building and developing a community that has a lot in common with Aldea. And so I'm excited for you to hear from him today. Of course, if you're new here, something that you'll probably discover if you spend any amount of time at our community is that, we like to invite a diversity of voices and perspectives to share here at Aldea. And so, when it comes to what you're going to hear today, whether it's sort of the particular religious or faith tradition that's being spoken from, or some of the political views, it might not be something that you resonate with 100%. You might say, okay, that's Doug's story. That might not be my story. And I just want to affirm that is totally okay. That's part of the experience here at Aldea. We love to learn from people who have different perspectives, who approach things a little differently. So, you're going to hear some Christian language, and you might say, well, that's not what I identify with. And that's what we love about Aldea, is that diversity of perspective, coming together, learning from one another. So I hope you just benefit from the various ideas and insights expressed in this conversation. And if there's something that, is new or maybe challenging for you, that you just allow that to provoke your thinking. But, know that you'll come back next week and you'll hear something entirely different. And I hope that you're enriched by that diversity. So with that said, let's jump right into this conversation with Doug. I've been looking forward actually for a while for an opportunity to introduce you to the Aldea community, because you have become very influential to them, whether or not they realize it, through our connection.
Oh, Aldea community.
And so, I'm just really excited for you to get to distill some of the things that we've talked about over many conversations, perhaps in just to a bite-sized format that our community can just chew on. We had this series that we finished up a couple weeks ago called Holy Shift, which in part was inspired by some conversations that you and I had about the future of church and the future of religion. And this series was about, in many ways, what are those moments for us as individuals when we experience some shifts in consciousness, or the ways that we think, that we just fundamentally have some paradigm shifts that really change our lives forever. And so as a way of getting to know you and understand a little bit about your journey, I'd love it if you could just share maybe just some moments that were holy shifts for you.
Well, first, I bet you felt very clever with that title.
Well, I borrowed it. I borrowed it too. I feel like I borrowed the title, and then I really leaned into the shift part. So I got a laugh every week, which was, more than I was expecting.
I'll tell you probably the biggest shift in my own life, and it'll help you understand a little bit about me as well. I grew up in a pretty unhealthy family system, lots of detail, but super ugly. And you can't but grow up in that kind of system and not come up with baggage along the way, as I did. And part of our family's toxicity was we were one generation away from an alcoholic family system, and my mother swore before God and everything holy that we would not even use alcohol. So she chose a religion on the basis of which one made alcohol a sin. And but it's hard to escape those patterns. What we ended up doing was using religion the same way that alcoholic families use alcohol or substances. And we used it to medicate our pain. We used it to avoid things that needed to be dealt with. We used it for all kinds of things. It was our magical approach. And so I was a super devout young person. And along the way, it worked for me. I got lots of accolades from the community that I was part of, the many communities that I was part of. And in my 20s, I went into a time of depression and not realizing that the root cause of that was that this form of toxic religion was driving me at a pace human beings aren't designed to go at. And so I did that, and I lived that way, and I didn't realize that I was medicating a deep core pain, and I certainly didn't realize the source of that deep core pain. It was an evolutionary process. It didn't happen all at once. So my first church job after that was at a relatively traditional American Christian megachurch in Los Angeles, and I was the college minister. And I noticed that the young people were not connecting with the church outside of the college group. And that was kind of the point of the college group, to be this intermediary between their childhood and their adulthood. And part of their adulthood would be engaging with the church. But I also began to understand why they weren't. And that kind of started me writing memos. We didn't have emails back then. We had these interoffice envelopes where you would type a memo and you would put it in and send it. And 2 days later, you'd get a response back saying, hey, we are losing a younger generation. And if we don't do this and this and this and this and this, we're going to not have them 30 years from now. We're going to be very different. So we've got to think these thoughts. And after a few years of that, I created some discomfort for the folks around because I was loved and I loved them. I was loyal and they were loyal to me. And there was dissonance in the system because I was writing about these things. And so eventually the senior minister of the church took me out and said, Doug, these kind of memos, I can't dismiss them. They're the kinds of things that a senior minister ought to be writing. And he said, this church, you might have noticed, has a senior minister. So I think you should go somewhere and be in charge. That's what I think you ought to do. But what that experience did was frame for me, it's not this church that's the problem, or that church that's the problem, or that church that's the problem, because this was one of the best churches I knew. It was the best church I knew. I thought it was one of the best churches that there was. I started to think the problem isn't with this or that church. The problem is church. And the problem is something inside is failing. And so I left. And so I came here to Raleigh to start this church. But I landed with a tremendous sense of disorientation because I kind of knew what not to do. And what not to do was everything that I was familiar with. And what not to do was everything that I knew how to do to start a church. What to do was still pretty elusive. And so it became a series over the first 10 years of experiments. We called ourselves a laboratory for a long time, not a church. We're trying to figure out what makes healthy spiritual community. And so we tried a lot of things, and we kind of hit on, you have to start with the story, because our institutions might be failing, but they're failing because the behaviors of the people inside those institutions are failing. But it's very difficult to change the behaviors of the people inside the systems without first changing the instincts that drive those behaviors. But it's very difficult to change those instincts that drive those behaviors if you don't first change the core framing narrative. God is both mean-spirited and hypocritical. He says, I love you, I love you, I love you, but he's going to make you pay. He's going to take vengeance. He's going to. Well, one of the main critiques of Christians is that we are hypocritical and mean-spirited. Well, that comes from the core story we tell ourselves. So maybe Christians are actually worse people than everybody else in the world, or maybe we've got our story wrong. The first 10 years of our time, most of my lessons started with the word rethinking. Rethinking God, rethinking prayer, rethinking Jesus, rethinking what is spirit, rethinking, went through this whole litany of things. Most of the chapters, most of those things became headings out of the chapters of a systematic theology book. All the things that Christians are supposed to believe. Let's rethink all that stuff. My family, I told you, was whacked. And after I had just left, I was out running early one morning. It was like 5 a.m, and there was a convenience store open. And I went in to get something to drink, and they had a rack by the register with a whole bunch of bumper stickers on it. And one of the bumper stickers, I read it and I laughed for the next hour. I couldn't even run the rest of the way home. I just laughed and laughed and laughed and laughed and laughed because it was my family system. And it said, never try and teach a pig to sing. It'll waste your time and it'll really annoy the pig. And what I realized is I don't want to spend my energy persuading the unpersuaded. Now I care about building something that folks can use. I do think I'm participating in a reformation. I think we're doing now what the reformers did in 1500. I think we're trying to adapt the narrative that we inherited to a new worldview that we live in, a fundamentally different view of reality. That's why I talked about quantum physics in the book that I wrote. It's quantum physics tells us the world that we live in isn't Newton's world. This table looks solid, but it's not solid. We live in this illusory world. And so how do we tell a story in that world? And I quit trying to talk to people who were very persuaded and convinced, and I began to try and talk to people who were persuadable, who were looking for something, who were hungry for something, who wanted a way of being both spiritual and communal. And that's kind of what's been the last 30 years of my life, is building that. But no, I didn't go to the Heritage Trial for the first 10 years. So the last 20 years of my life has been building that. So I told you for the first 10 years, I would say 70% of my lessons started with the word rethinking. The next 10 years, there was some overlap in there while I was writing the book, were about rethinking the practices. Because the church that I grew up in had basically two main spiritual practices: read your Bible every day, pray to God every day. And there was another one in there, give your money, but that was maybe a little selfishly motivated by ministers who talked about it. And then there was maybe another one, serve the homeless, make sandwiches for homeless people. But for the most part, it was read your Bible and pray. And I was part of a community. The folks who joined had been a devout bunch. And we had read our Bible and we had prayed. And we were, some of us, still reading our Bible and still praying. And we also knew that there was this gaping wound in our souls, and there was this arid desert in our souls, and we needed something more. So I started studying spiritual practices. And I started studying where I always start, which is in history, and went back through all of our tradition and looked at what are the things that people have done. And then I started even looking outside of our tradition. What is it that the Buddhists do? And it turns out that what the Buddhists do and what the Trappists were then rediscovering, back right after Vatican II, of the meditative practices, the contemplative practices, and all of those things. I just would do a lesson on it, and then I'd form a small group and we'd practice it. And then we would tweak it and then adjust it, and then we would do it, and we would do that. But, that's a lot of time to be practicing those things. So the list got really long. And it was a little bit cumbersome to hand someone this massive list and say, here, these are the things that you do for a healthy soul. So I was really just trying to think about how I could communicate it more effectively. So I looked at this list eventually, and then I put it on a landscape piece of paper with 4 columns. And I split those columns into 4 categories. There are practices that we do that are communal. There are practices that we do that are contemplative. There are practices that we do that are learning, and there are practices that we do that are serving. And if we look at those really do comprise everything that I had researched through most of human history that makes human souls healthy, that brings transformation to our lives, that makes us better people, that awakens us to the interior light and the interior divine. If we call them things we can do today, that if we will do today, make it possible tomorrow to do things we cannot yet do. So these are the things that if we do them, they will put us on a path of changing, transforming, awakening, death to the ego self, the awakening of the inner light self. We got a gazillion words for talking about it. Well, then one day I was getting ready to have a meeting where we were going to talk about this, and I realized, even that's a little cumbersome. So I put it on a circle, bisected the circle, and made it 4 quadrants of the circle. And so that's when we started calling doing these practices working the circle. And we would say all the time, no one of these quadrants is more important than the other, but we do put the communal practices first. And the reason we put them first is if you develop relationship, you will be able to do the contemplative practices much better, the learning practices much better, and the serving practices much better. And so that has become for us. And then so we have a Sunday. It started off every January. I would call it a guide. The lesson that Sunday would be a guide to the announcements at Common Thread. Back then we were NRCC, but it's a guide to the announcements at Common Thread. And basically I would outline, this is what that circle is. And then I would say, and here's my pledge to you, nothing's going to show up on the announcements that isn't somehow rooted in these practices that are transformative. We hold everything that we do as a community up against this. Does it change our human lives? And does it make the world around us a better place? These are the things that we do. And so we've been doing that for years, and we've developed within each one of those quadrants a whole bunch of very, very specific practices. Like we do a self-awareness practice, and that's both communal and learning, and we work in the service quadrant with both service work, which is like making sandwiches for people, but it's also systems work. How do we change the systems that mean that some people don't have sandwiches? And we've developed each one of these quadrants through the years substantially. And now that I've kind of passed over leadership, I'm watching the next generation. They're refining it even better. They're doing more with it. And so that's kind of how we got to work in the circle.
Part of just living life in community is addressing the evolving needs of people. And you alluded to the fact that there's feeding someone a sandwich, and also addressing the system that created the hunger in the first place. And I think so much of being in spiritual community is being really honest about what's going on in the world, and how do we not only address our own ability to affect change in our community, but also how do we just live in this changing landscape? And so I've come to you over the past couple of months with just my own questions and wanting to learn about how to lead a community in a time where the political division feels like it's unprecedented, although you've been a minister for 30 years. So I'm sure you've seen every sort of, political, social landscape. And so that's why it's been really comforting for me to have someone to talk to about how to address these things. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit to, just what your approach has been. I know you recently handed off primary leadership responsibility at Common Thread. So congratulations for essentially your what you might call retirement. But just even in these last couple of months, and certainly over the past decade, as we look at a massive shift politically, and just a lot of fear and polarization, what has been some of you talk about the plumb line, what's been your plumb line for this time in history?
I haven't seen this in 30 years. But again, a student of history. And personally, I've, try and look at this whole spectrum and see through the lens of an independent. I think there's sometimes when we should conserve the values of the past. There's sometimes when we should progress beyond limitations of the past. And the ongoing debate, I think, is a healthy thing. I think it's a good thing. But no, nobody believed me. Everybody thought I was just a damn liberal in sheep's clothing,
Yeah.
And so we ended up losing most of our conservative constituents, and primarily because, we were rethinking something that felt bedrock. And if you're going to rethink bedrock things, then you must be one of them. So that meant I was mostly talking to left-leaning people. So mostly what I've been saying to left-leaning people is, look, you're who's here. So let's talk to you. Let's not spend our time trying to talk about how bad the folks on the other side are. Let's talk about our part. And so we have spent most of our time saying, these are the things that we have to see about ourselves. And pray to God that there's somebody over on the right doing the same thing. But we can't be responsible for that. We can only be responsible for what's ahead of us. We can't be responsible for changing the world because that will immobilize us. We've got to focus on here, now, small, doable, things that I can actually make a change with and that I can keep doing today and next week and for all the years that I get left on this earth, consistently being about making the world a better place. So how do we do that? And it starts with our own introspection. We work really hard to understand why are the people on the other side doing what they're doing? What have they felt along the way? What have they experienced along the way? Because we have this starting conviction. We say it every Sunday. We have these 4 affirmations that we make every week, 3 affirmations we make. We just repeat one of them. And it is that we are, every one of us, carriers of the indwelling divine. And as soon as you say we are, every one of us, carriers of the indwelling divine, that means the people who are as jacked up on the other side as we are jacked up on this side are also carriers of the indwelling divine. That means there is light and life and patience and kindness and goodness and joy and peace in them, just like there is in me. I have been guilty of not behaving from my deepest divine center. So maybe I could have a little gratitude, a little latitude for the people who are also not behaving from their deepest divine center. But let me not discount it, and let me not tell them that they are deplorable, and let me not tell them that they are, Satan incarnate. Let me not tell them that. So we work really hard to look at our side of the fence, and we work really hard to try and open lines of conversation with folks on the other side.
Ram Dass would have whoever the most divisive political figure of that day was, he would have that person on his altar. So he would kind of see them every morning, and they'd be alongside Jesus, and they'd be alongside his guru. And they were saying, it was almost like the divine was peeking out through that person going, I bet you're having a hard time seeing me here, right? So that reminds me a lot of what you're saying. And something that you've said to me that I found to be really thought-provoking was this idea that maybe we subconsciously or consciously behave as though we just want to see a world in which all the people that disagree with us, they just might go away. We behave as though, hey, wouldn't it be nice if just everyone agreed with me? But if everyone agreed with me, then we're kind of saying that everyone who doesn't agree with me, where they're going to go? They're just going to snap. They're going to disappear. And so you've used some metaphors to describe that to me, but I just, I'd love you to speak for a moment on that idea of how, if we're talking about a better, more unified world that we're trying to build, that world needs to have a place for all people. If it doesn't work for the people who I disagree with, then it really doesn't work for me on some fundamental level.
I was watching a documentary on fast fashion. Then the documentary was basically, where do all those clothes go? And they end up, a lot of them, on the beaches of really poor countries. Because when we say recycling, or when we talk about charity, what we're really doing is just dumping all of our shit that we don't know what to do with. We can't put it in our landfills. We can't just drop it in the ocean. So we've developed a story about where we're going to send it. And then you find this stuff, it's just sitting, plastering these beaches everywhere. which there was one phrase in there, which was, there is no away. You can't throw stuff away. You could put it somewhere else, but you can't throw it away. And when I heard that, I thought that is basically what I've been trying to tell our community for a long, long time about the other. They're not going to go away. We can shout them down. And for a long time, the liberals did shout down and shame the conservatives and just call them backward cretins. We did a lot of things to shout them down, but they're not going away. They're going to come back. They're just going to come back more resentful. And so if we don't treat them like they are carriers of the divine now, I promise you they're going to be less demonstration of a carrier of divine the next time they come around. And that's in many ways what we're seeing. If we see some of the ugliness on the right, I think in many ways the left is culpable because we have treated people like shit. And if you treat people like shit, they're going to act like shit. And if you shame them and if you tell them they don't belong, and if you reduce the amount of status they have in the society because they can't do the elite kinds of things, or if you do that, you're going to end up paying the price. So you can make a gated community to keep all the riffraff at bay. You can do whatever you want to do, but eventually we are one, we are not two. And everything is connected and there is no away. And so if we don't start to act that way and develop practices that are training us to be able to live in that world, we're just going to keep perpetuating all the ugly that's just going on. Because, Martin Luther King had a thing that said, I listened to his speeches about every 5 years for about 15, 20 years of my life. And there's one speech, and I've looked all over and I cannot find it again. But he basically said about Bull Connor, this really mean-spirited sheriff in somewhere in Alabama, I think it was. He said, it's not going to be enough for us to defeat Bull Connor. Because if we defeat Bull Connor, we're just going to change places. And the dynamic's going to stay the same. But what we've got to do is much harder. We have got to befriend Bull Connor until the day comes when Bull Connor is fighting for what we're fighting for with the same energy that we're fighting for what we're fighting for. Mm-hmm. The only way to really get rid of an enemy is to make that enemy a friend. And so that's why nonviolence resistance, that's why all the work on relationship building, that's why all of that stuff, we're not going to go slap you in the face. Because in the end, that's just going to make it harder for us to get what we want. So we're going to try and make this a collective reality. And it's based on the premise that's kind of been a foundational premise of our community, that everything is connected. Partly everything is connected, we tell, because everything is a carrier of the divine light. Everything is. Every person across the political spectrum, every gender, every variation of humanity, and all the things that are rocks and trees and they're all carriers of this divine breath from which everything was created. And we've got to learn to think of it as a comprehensive whole, as opposed to aligning ourselves with one of the parts of the whole. I think there is cause for exuberant optimism if you have a long enough time frame. If you're talking about a short time frame, the shit might hit the fan. But here are the reasons for optimism. The human race has this unquenchable thirst for self-correction. We try to get better. We try and fix things that are broken. I think some of the misguided attempts on the left and on the right are really an attempt to make things better. We are always trying to make things better. But we also have this propensity for, tunnel vision. And so consequently, when we are trying to make things better, we just see the part, we don't see the whole. So what that does, it creates this dynamic where pendulums swing through time. We swing way over here to this side, and then we swing way over here to this side. And, sometimes we find our way to the middle. So history would speak of hope. I'm very, very optimistic about religion because people haven't stopped being spiritual when they have stopped being religious. When you are doing anything alone, you're not doing it as well as you're doing it with other people. But you can't do it with other people because when you show up at the places where other people are doing it, you also get this toxic narrative. So the day will come when we will have a new narrative and we will have new practices mapped to those narrative. And that's kind of what I've thought of us as doing at Common Thread these 30 years, getting ready for the day when the culture will be ready. I say to folks at Common Thread, I have said, I got to remember, I'm not running the place anymore. I have said to people again and again, we are working hard to answer a question that nobody's asking. And the question we're asking is, what does healthy spiritual community look like? Religious people aren't asking the question because they think they already know. And non-religious people aren't asking the question because they don't think there is an answer. They just think that that's just so far gone. But the day will come when people will look up and say, yeah, we're looking for something that we can do together to make us better human beings. If we think of religion as just a set of supporting structures that if people will participate in those structures will awaken their own spirituality, awaken to their own interior light. If that's what we define it as, the problem with religion hasn't been religion. The problem has been that we've been organizing around the wrong structures, organizing structures.
You've been doing this really amazing work for 30 years. You're transitioning into a new phase. I'm just grateful for the influence and the voice you've been in my life. I know Common Thread is grateful for all the time that you've put in. I think that that next stage of renewal, we'll look back and you'll be one of the titans, I think, of, you're too humble for this, but I'll say it, you'll be one of those people that will be a part of that movement and have really done a lot to further the cause. And I know that Aldea is grateful for you speaking into our journey today. So thank you again. And I look forward to our next chat. And but for the rest of Aldea, until next time.